following program is a Springer Podcast Network production.
Yeah. Oh, sorry guys. Um, welcome back to the Cody Springer Show. This is episode 143, and this is the episode that's going to be appropriately titled, Why We're All Addicted to Our Phones. And my question to you guys is, how many times have you checked your phone today? Could you go an hour without looking at it? Now, I'm not saying that phones are evil. You know, this is not what this episode's about. I don't think our phones are the problem. I think the apps on our phones are the problem. And they're designed to keep us engaged for as long as possible. Now, do you guys remember when you got your first phone? You know, for me, it was a flip phone. And I know I could be aging myself here. Talking about me getting a damn flip phone. But do you guys remember when our phones were mainly used for calls and text messages? Well, then smartphones came along and it changed everything. And then next thing you know, we get to the dawn of the age of social media. You know, Facebook started becoming a thing. And then, you know, if you're a millennial like me, then you were on MySpace as well. But I don't think there was an app for MySpace. I don't think that there was. But Facebook was definitely at the center of social media around that time. And it became the center of our lives, and notifications became constant. You know, just getting messages and likes on your post, on your photos, sharing posts, basically at some point we stopped using our phones and our phones started using us. And it's crazy to think about, because, I remember being in school, right? I had a phone, like I said, I had a flip phone, and I just called and texted. And then, I got one of those keyboard phones. And then, then people started getting on Facebook. And at that time, Facebook was just desktop mostly, However, I started getting on Facebook through my phone. And then at school, they blocked the normal Facebook site, so nobody could get on it. But people started to find a way around that, and they got on the mobile version of Facebook. All you had to do is type in the address bar m.facebook.com, and you can get on the mobile version of Facebook. So basically, we outsmarted, the authority at school, and still got on social media that way. But then there's just that evolution that happened, and then Twitter came along. Now it's known as X, but it was started off as Twitter. So then everybody got on Twitter, and then Instagram came along. So you were using Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And those were the main apps that people were using for a period of time. And then, there was other apps that came along, such as like Tout, if you remember Tout. And then, people were getting on YouTube more as well. And then TikTok came along. And I believe that TikTok was what really got us in the situation. But yeah, it just became a thing where the apps themselves, they were fighting for your attention. With the infinite scrolling, putting videos on autoplay, auto scroll, notifications like crazy, getting it from, everywhere, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, if you had Snapchat, then you have the personalized algorithms, TikTok and their infamous algorithm. And then, you had YouTube and its algorithm as well. And then there was, streaks and on Snapchat, you had a Snapchat with someone every single day in order to keep a streak going. And then likes, on your photos, posts, all that. And then, you open Facebook to check one notification. And then 30 minutes later, you're watching videos of someone pressure washing driveways. But yeah, I mean, you can open up your phone with one purpose, and then you forget why you even picked it up because you got distracted with all this other shit. You start watching random videos. You start going through, posts in your feed. Like, oh, this is interesting that so-and-so posted that. Like last night, for example, I got on Facebook to check one thing. And then I noticed a former coworker of mine, posted something interesting. I'm like, oh, okay. This is definitely not like them. So I messaged them on Messenger and asked them what was going on. And then we got into a whole different thing. So, so what turned into just a quick app check turned into a whole like 20 to 25 minute conversation with my former coworker. But yeah, it's just the point is like you get so distracted easily with social media. It's crazy. You get on, check one specific thing, and the next thing you know, like you've been on this app for about a half an hour and didn't even realize it. And then you are like, dude, what am I doing? I got all this stuff I need to do. Why am I allowing myself to get so distracted with Facebook or TikTok? I need to get off of this shit and then get on with what I'm supposed to be doing. All right, now this is the point in the podcast where, we're going to be talking about TikTok. I mentioned TikTok earlier and how I felt like they are the reasons why we're kind of in this whole situation now with social media and being easily distracted. And I believe that TikTok introducing their short form video format has changed the way that we consume content on an everyday basis. Everything has to hook us immediately. And if we're not entertained instantly, we swipe. Yeah, it's crazy, and then it's also changed the podcasting game as well because, here I am used to doing anywhere from 30 to 45 to an hour long podcasts, but now I got to do extra work now. I have to take clips of my podcast and then upload them to TikTok and YouTube Shorts. And yeah, and then I have to use those in hopes that you guys will listen or watch my podcast. But yeah, but that's basically how it's become. Because of the integration of TikTok, the short form video has not only changed the way that we watch content, it has also created shorter attention spans. And you can't tell me that I'm wrong. You're probably, listening to my podcast right now while still, looking at stuff on your phone. So but basically, with the integration of TikTok and with YouTube Shorts, we're skipping videos. If it's something we're not even remotely interested in, we swipe, go on to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing after that. And then, we can fast forward through podcasts now, where we can change the speed of the rate of speech that's in the podcast and just fast forward through stuff. And then, we're sitting down and, we put on a movie and then we get distracted with something on our phone. So we're not even paying attention to the movie or TV show that we're watching. And then we're just reading headlines instead of the full-on articles that get posted. So my question is, have we trained ourselves to get bored faster? I think it's a valid point to bring up, and I think, it's affected, how people do things, because I mean, we used to be able to sit down and watch a full movie from start to finish, and then know everything that's happened in the movie. But now, with our phones and everything, you could be watching a movie and then you get a notification through Facebook and you're like, oh, I got to check that real quick. And the next thing you know, you've missed like half the movie because you're more interested in what's going on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or whatever. Like, you just get distracted so damn easily with what's happening on your phone that you've missed like half the movie. And then, if you're watching the movie with your significant other or a friend, you turn to them and be like, oh, what just happened? It's like, oh, dude, you just missed like half the fucking movie because you've been, too engrossed in your phone. And you're like, oh shit. And then you realize, wow, why am I allowing myself to be so easily distracted by what's going on my phone? So, yeah, I just think that, we have this need now where, it has to get our attention right away. And if it doesn't have our attention, if we're not entertained, then we just lose interest altogether. And to be honest, I think it's quite sad. Now, we're going to get into the heart of the podcast right now and talk about what is going on in real life and how our phones are affecting certain activities that people do. Like, take a family, for example. Like, let's say it's a family of 5, and they're sitting together, at the dinner table. They're eating dinner, but everyone is on a different app. They're on their phone. Let's say dad's on Amazon. He's looking for something to buy, for his garage. And let's say, the wife, she's on Facebook. She wants to see what the Facebook drama is. Maybe she's in one of those community discussion board groups. And let's say the oldest son, let's say he's on TikTok. He's looking at gaming computer stuff. And then let's say the daughter, she's on TikTok looking at makeup stuff. And then let's say the youngest son, he's more engrossed into someone playing a game, streaming a game. Let's say, they're streaming, a content creator. Let's take Kai Cenat, for example. They're streaming Kai Cenat's latest stream, and that's what they're watching. So everyone's sitting together, but instead of everyone talking to each other, asking each other about their day, oh, how was work? How was school? Oh, do you need help with your homework? Do you need to do this? Do you need to do that? No, everyone's more worried about what's going on their phone, and everyone's on a different app. The focus is not at the dinner table. It's on whatever app that they're currently on at that moment in time. And then we're going to go back to the TV situation. Let's say it's a couple watching TV. but somebody asks, "Oh, wait, what happened?" Like like let's say it's a husband and wife, and let's say the husband's into the show. He really wants to know what's going to happen. And then the wife is on her phone. She's going through TikTok, watching random videos, and then something interesting happens. Like let's say an explosion happens, or a character got shot, or something like that. And then she's like, "Wait, what happened?" So yeah, like I said, they're missing out on what's going on. And then let's say a group of friends get together, but nobody's really talking because they're just sitting around on their phones. So friends, yeah, they're friends and they're hanging out, but they're not communicating, they're not talking to each other, and they're not building fucking memories because they're just sitting around talking. And that really concerns me about the next generation, because it's like, is this what they're gonna do? Is this what my son is gonna do when he grows up and he hangs out with his friends? They're just gonna sit around and dick around on their phones for several hours? I hope not. And then go into restaurants. You go to a restaurant. Let's say you're going to go on a date with your significant other, and then instead of talking and stuff like that, you guys get distracted with your phones. Oh, so and so posted something on Facebook. Gotta check it out. Or oh yeah, my friend posted a picture on Instagram. Isn't this cute? Blah blah blah. And instead of communicating and building up those relationships, it's just distractions. 1,000% distractions. You go to concerts. Let's say you're going to go to a Post Malone concert, for example, and instead of vibing out to the music and everything, you're more into what's going on in your phone. I think Disturbed, which is one of my all-time favorite bands. David Draymond, the lead singer, he caught somebody on their phone during one of their concerts, and he's like, "Are we not entertaining enough for you?" He called him out in front of everybody. And he's like, "Get off your fucking phone." So, yeah, man. And then sporting events too. You could be at a football game. And it's a high scoring affair, touchdowns left and right. And then, someone sitting there on their phone, like, come on, man. Why did you waste the money on a ticket to come to this game if you're really not going to, watch it or allow yourself to be entertained by what you're seeing? So the bottom line is that we're physically present, but mentally we're somewhere else. We're just in this whole world of social media, and once someone's like hooked into it, it's really hard to pull them out of it. So let's talk about boredom. Because I don't think phones didn't kill boredom. They just changed the way how we deal with boredom. Because when we're bored and everything, we get on TikTok and then we scroll through each video and everything, and then you're having this reaction like, "Oh, I'm still bored. I don't know what to do." When was the last time you just sat with your thoughts? Like you just really sat down and really thought about life and thought about the things you do? When was that the last time you did that? And if you can't tell me when that last time was, then wow. Like, yeah, it's basically to the point where these apps and the way they hook us, it's like we're losing touch with reality. It really is. Because people can be sitting around being bored out of their fucking mind. Like, "Oh, I don't know what to do." Like, "Oh, how about you, go out and do something, go to the park, go to the gym, you know, uh, go, I don't know, sit somewhere, go get a coffee ice cream and whatnot. But instead, they're just like, oh, I'm just going to sit at home and, I'm just going to, be on my phone and do this. That's basically the mentality. But, sometimes I just think you need to just like, just sit down and just really think about life. Think about what you're doing and just, just really think and allow yourself to feel things. Because that's what makes you a human being. Your thoughts and your feelings, that's what makes you human. And I'm afraid that these apps are making you less than human. They're making you, I don't really want to use the term zombified, but that's kind of what comes to mind sometimes with these apps. They're just like making you kind of like a zombie. You just need to consume social media content, and that's basically what it is that they want you to do. And it's definitely concerning for sure, and it's not just Gen Z the crowd that I'm talking about. It's millennials that are falling into this trap, and even Gen X, that has fallen into this kind of trap as well. We're all getting into this habit of scrolling and paying more attention to our phones than we are to each other. So now let's talk about what it's doing to our memory. Because you can walk into a room and forget why you're even in there. Let's say you wanted to walk into your bedroom because, you forgot your wallet. Your wallet's on the nightstand, and then you walk into your bedroom, and you forget why you're even there. And then you pick up your phone, and then you're forgetting what you're doing. And then you're missing out on conversations, missing details in TV shows, and then you're depending on Google for every little thing. So my question is, are we remembering less because we never give our brains time to focus? Like we are getting to that point where, we're just missing the mark. We're just getting to that point where we're just forgetting shit, Now, because, and here's the thing, I'm guilty of this as well. I'm not saying that I remember every single thing. No, my memory has been pretty shoddy over the last couple years, but, I also think that's because of my car accident that happened in 2020, where I hit my head on the steering wheel pretty hard, because ever since then, I've had memory issues, short-term memory. But yeah, like sometimes I could be walking into a room and forgetting why I'm even in there. And then I have to remind myself like, oh, I was in here to get this, and then, yeah, like you tend to just forget shit. And like I said, you're so distracted that, you're missing out on details, missing out on conversations, and then, yeah, like I said, you're searching up Google for every little thing. So yeah, we're having a focusing problem as well. And it all comes back to this thing. It's crazy. It all comes back to the phone, and it's also coming back to the apps on our phones. So, it makes you wonder, are we losing connection? Because a lot of people, they rather text instead of calling. They will send memes instead of having conversations. And then there's social media followers versus real friendships. This is especially true if you're a content creator, and then you have your social media followers who, they hype you up, they praise you. And then you have your real friendships that may not be so glamorous and praising all the time. And then you have young kids, anywhere from 2 to 5 years old, who's growing up with tablets, and adults doing the same thing. Like they're not growing up with tablets, but they're getting on technology and they're just, engrossed with that. So, yeah, are we just losing connection with people? Are we more so focused on technology than we are building actual, real connection? Because if that's where we're headed, then life's going to be very hard for people in the future. It's going to be hard to build friendships, build relationships. And then it's just going to lead to a lot of lonely people in this world, which affects mental health. And, without me even saying anything, where that's going to lead. But, yeah, it's becoming a pretty depressing state of affairs, when it comes to social media, and I've also read studies recently that, a lot of younger people are trying to go back to the old way of doing things. Like there's a push for like blockbusters to return and using analog forms of media instead of, doing digital and streaming apps. People are trying to find VCRs, DVD players, and getting physical copies of movies to, watch these movies. So basically, the younger generation is doing what I grew up with when I was a kid. Because I had to use a VCR, I had to use a DVD player. There wasn't all these streaming apps that we have now. Netflix, we were just getting it through the mail. It wasn't a streaming app at that time. We would choose the movies that we wanted to rent from Netflix, and Netflix would send them in the mail. And then after you were done, you'd send them back. But yeah, man, the old way of doing things, they've really made it to where we're so dependent on technology. Now more than ever. But it is good to see that the younger generation is starting to say, you know what, enough's enough with this shit. I want to do the things the old school way. I want to watch movies on a DVD player. I want to actually learn a skill instead of watching somebody, on YouTube. I want to actually do things the way that people in the 90s used to do it. So, are we losing connection? Yes. But I do think that there is some hope for the future. So, I'm not telling anybody to delete TikTok or throw their phone in the trash. I use these apps too. They've helped me with this podcast and getting it back up and running and everything. But I think it's worth asking ourselves one question. Are you using your phone, or is your phone using you? Maybe the answer isn't less technology. Maybe it's being more intentional with how we use it. Just some food for thought for today, guys. And that's going to conclude today's episode. I thank you guys for listening to this podcast and watching it on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and anywhere you get this podcast. And this podcast is a part of the Springer Podcast Network. Also, if you haven't, for the wrestling fans, go ahead and check out the return of Pro Wrestling Focus, dropped this past week. So go ahead and be sure to check it out. And then there will be an announcement coming shortly on other podcasts coming to the Springer Podcast Network, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, take care, and I will be talking to you guys very soon.